This is one of the longest and loudest arguments in modern history, a fight that survived revolutions, toppled empires, bankrupted superpowers, and split the world in two. For more than a century, capitalism and socialism were not just economic theories. They were battle lines. Behind every patriotic speech, every worker uprising, every recession, and every proxy war, this argument was there. The world we live in was shaped largely by this ideological clash. But there is one truth almost no ideological narrative says out loud. Neither system worked the way the textbooks promised. Not once. Not anywhere. When pressure increased, war, famine, inflation, economic collapse, reality revealed itself with brutal clarity. The story begins long before anyone uttered the words capitalism or socialism. For most of human history, the economy wasn't really an economy at all. It was a struggle for survival. Rulers claimed divine right. Landowners owned almost everything. Peasants produced just enough not to starve. Progress moved slower than glaciers. For thousands of years, human life was a zero-sum game. If one rose, another fell. Wealth came from land, labor, and war. Productivity barely increased. The idea that ordinary people could become rich through trade or innovation sounded like madness. Then the Industrial Revolution shook the world. In the late 1700s, England was like a pressure cooker filled with coal, iron, capital, and relentless ambition. Machines replaced muscle power, factories replaced workshops, and a completely new kind of power emerged, the power of private capital. For the first time, individuals could invest, take risks, and own property on a scale previously reserved only for kings. Productivity exploded. Wages rose for some, while misery deepened for others. Inequality widened at a pace societies had never experienced before. Pollution choked cities. Children worked 12-hour shifts. Slums bred disease. Yet, no matter how ugly it was, one undeniable fact remained. Capitalism was producing more goods, wealth, and speed than the world had ever seen. This was the moment socialism was born, not as a utopian dream, but as a desperate and powerful reaction to the brutality of industrial capitalism. In the mid-1800s, thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels looked at smoking factory chimneys, worker revolts, and production floors stained with sweat and blood, and reached a conclusion. The problem was not individual bosses. It was the system itself. Capitalist wealth, they argued, was stolen labor. What was presented as opportunity was, in reality, exploitation itself. They claimed that if workers collectively owned factories, if profits were shared, and if production served human needs rather than private gain, society could finally be just. No more exploitation, no more boom and bust cycles, just rational planning and equal dignity. It sounded clean, elegant, morally powerful, and to millions crushed under the gears of early capitalism, it felt like justice. But theory and real life were very different things. When the world seriously tried socialism at a national scale for the first time, it didn't happen in classrooms or on book pages, but in the ashes of an empire. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, Lenin inherited a starving, illiterate, backward country. The Tsar was gone. The old elites had fled or been executed. And suddenly, a vast territory of 150 million people needed a new economic operating system. The Soviets built that system. Land, factories, banks, and resources were nationalized. Prices were set by bureaucrats. Production targets replaced profit motives. Private enterprise was erased. In theory, this should have created perfect equality and efficiency. In practice, it produced chaos. Without market prices, planners couldn't know what people wanted or how much to produce. Without competition, factories didn't innovate. Without personal reward, workers had no reason to go beyond the bare minimum. Famines became routine. Queues became a culture. Agriculture, the backbone of the Russian economy, collapsed. Lenin eventually had to allow limited private trade just to keep the country alive. And yet something strange happened. Despite all these failures, socialism kept its appeal. Because capitalism didn't look so good either. By the early 20th century, capitalism had delivered enormous growth, but at the cost of savage instability. Speculation ran wild. Trust choked the economy. The wealthy lived like modern aristocrats, while millions struggled to survive. The system was good at creating wealth, but terrible at distributing it. That imbalance exploded in 1929. The Great Depression wasn't a simple recession, it was a global economic heart attack. Banks collapsed. Unemployment hit 25%. Countries watched their financial systems disintegrate. For millions, capitalism no longer looked flawed, it looked dangerous. By the 1930s, the world faced an uncomfortable truth. Neither system worked as advertised. Socialism promised equality but delivered scarcity. Capitalism promised prosperity but delivered collapse. Then came the moment that changed everything: World War II. The war forced every major economy to test its system under maximum pressure. The Soviet Union, despite its inefficiencies, mobilized its entire population with terrifying speed and discipline. State control allowed all resources to be directed toward survival. Capitalist countries like the United States showed how powerful private innovation could be when backed by strong national coordination. When the war ended, the scoreboard was no longer ideological. It was about GDP, infrastructure, productive capacity, growth, and living standards. From 1945 to 1991, the world became a massive laboratory. On one side stood the Soviet bloc: central planning, state control, suppressed markets. On the other stood the U.S. and its allies. Regulated capitalism, private enterprise, but with safety nets built from the lessons of the Great Depression. This was the real experiment. Not manifestos, not speeches. Millions of people living with the results. The outcomes were dramatic. In the Soviet Union, the early decades brought rapid industrialization. Literacy rose, housing expanded, military power surged. But beneath the surface, the system slowly cracked. Without price signals, the economy slid into absurd inefficiency. Factories filled quotas with useless goods. Farms delivered rotten harvests. Innovation stalled. By the 1970s, the Soviets were decades behind in consumer technology. A country that could build rockets couldn't produce a decent refrigerator. Capitalism, meanwhile, adapted. After the Great Depression, governments introduced regulations, deposit insurance, antitrust laws, social security systems, public health care, and unemployment benefits. Capitalism didn't become fair, but it became survivable. It learned from its mistakes. And that adaptability became its greatest strength. By the 1980s, the gap was undeniable. Living standards in the West rose, while the Soviet economy stagnated. The Cold War wasn't won by ideology, it was won by performance. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the debate seemed over. The Soviet Union wasn't defeated by bombs or invasions. It was defeated by empty shelves, broken incentives, and an economy that couldn't keep up. A system designed to eliminate inequality had produced new elites. Party bosses, bureaucrats, insiders. Ordinary people stood in breadlines. And when the numbers came in, the story was clear. Western economies were more productive, more innovative, and more adaptable. But capitalism's victory lap didn't last long. The Cold War ended, but economic contradictions didn't. In the 1990s and 2000s, capitalism evolved again. Finance grew. Global supply chains connected continents. Credit flowed freely. Inequality returned on a scale reminiscent of the Gilded Age. Corporations became transnational powers. Economies became dependent on debt, speculation, and asset bubbles. The 2008 financial crisis reminded the world that capitalism's instability had never really disappeared. It had just returned in a new form. At the same time, socialism returned too, not in its old Soviet form, but in a softer, more nostalgic version. Wealth taxes, public health care, free education, strong unions, and calls for economic rebalancing reappeared across many countries. Younger generations crushed by housing prices and stagnant wages began questioning who capitalism actually worked for. The debate was back, but this time it was different. Almost no one wanted pure capitalism or pure socialism. History had made the costs of both painfully clear. Look at the Nordic countries. They are often mislabeled as socialist. In reality, they have free markets, private enterprise, and global corporations. But they also have high taxes, strong social safety nets, and powerful unions. This is capitalism with guardrails. Look at the United States. Massive innovation, financial depth, and global influence, but also deep wealth gaps, decaying infrastructure, expensive healthcare, and a shrinking middle class. Look at China, the most complex case. Beijing calls it socialism with Chinese characteristics, but in practice it's state-directed capitalism. Private firms drive growth, the state controls strategic sectors, and markets are free only so long as they serve national priorities, and even China faces the same problems: debt-fueled growth, housing bubbles, demographic decline, and slowing productivity. Step back, and the truth becomes surprisingly simple. Every major economy today is a hybrid, a mix of markets and state power, a balance of incentives and protections, freedom paired with control. This happened not because ideologies failed, but because reality forced compromise. When systems collide with human behavior, ambition, greed, fear, laziness, creativity, no theory remains pure. And the uncomfortable lesson is this: economic systems shape people as much as people shape economic systems. Human nature doesn't disappear under capitalism or socialism. It just shows up in different ways. In the pure capitalism, ambition turns into innovation until it turns into exploitation. In pure socialism, equality turns into unity until it turns into repression. In markets, power concentrates in wealth. In planned economies, power concentrates in politics. Different systems, same human tendencies. Different propaganda, same flaws. That's why the real question isn't which system is better. The real question is which system has better mechanisms to restrain power, correct mistakes, and reward useful behavior. History's answer is clear. The system that can adapt wins. Capitalism survived because it reinvented itself. From laissez-faire to the New Deal, from global finance to tech capitalism. Socialism collapsed where it refused to evolve. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, North Korea. But it survived where it merged with markets: Scandinavia, post-1978 China, and parts of Western Europe. Ideology didn't decide the winner. Adaptation did. And you don't need a PhD in economics to understand this. You just need to look at what each system prioritizes. Capitalism prioritizes incentives. When it works well, it unleashes creativity, risk-taking, and efficiency. But the cost is inequality, instability, and the crushing of the vulnerable. Socialism prioritizes equality. When it works well, it reduces poverty, expands access, and provides basic dignity. But when incentives weaken, productivity falls. When markets disappear, information collapses. When institutions aren't transparent, corruption quietly grows. Both systems have strengths. Both have serious failures, and both have bloody histories. The world we live in today is built on these historical scars. Every regulation, every social program, every market rule, every financial instrument carries the imprint of this century-long struggle. Modern mixed economies are not proof that one system won, but proof that no system works alone. But there's one thing most people miss. The debate is changing again, because the challenges of the 21st century, artificial intelligence, demographic collapse, climate risk, energy transition, global debt, don't respect ideology. Market capitalism struggles with long-term planning and social cohesion. Socialist planning struggles with flexibility and innovation. The countries that succeed in the next century will be those that best combine these forces. The creativity of markets with the resilience of public investment, private innovation with public direction, freedom with stability. If the last century taught us anything, it's this: no system works without guardrails, no economy survives without incentives, and power, whether concentrated in billionaires or bureaucrats, destroys societies when it becomes too concentrated. History didn't choose capitalism or socialism. History chose whatever prevented collapse, and every generation has to rebuild that balance. Because this debate was never really about capitalism versus socialism. It was always about who controls the levers inside the system: capital, the state, banks, unions, corporations, parties, regulators. The fight was always about the same thing: power. And history shows again and again that power never disappears. It only changes hands. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. The answers are in history. I'll show you where to look.